Hey everyone! So I know it's been a while, but I'm back to make a Risk of Rain 2 item tier list. I have a few hours on this game, so I hope my opinions on this list aren't too controversial, but due to the size of this list and for the sake of my own time, I'll only be going over items that I feel warrant an explanation. For instance, I won't be explaining why an ATG belongs in S tier, or why the humble bison steak belongs in F tier. But, for whatever reason, if you think those items need an explanation, good luck. I think that most people can agree, for the most part, on what the top and what the bottom tier items are, what the gold standard for items is in Risk of Rain, and what to send to the shredder. Alright, so kicking things off in the garbage tier, we have the absolute worst item in Risk of Rain 2, the Squid Polyp. If I could put any item in a category below F tier, I would put the Squid Polyp and the Squid Polyp only. The amount of times I have lost a run because the Squid Polyp got infected by a Void Infester after I popped a Void Cradle is too many times to count. And no matter the case, no matter what survivor I'm playing, if I get a Squid Polyp, my main goal is to throw it out immediately. Another item I feel that's worth going over in the garbage tier is definitely going to be the newly hatched Zoea. Generally, all of the Void items in the Survivors of the Void DLC are actually fairly good. Some of them are at worst side grades, but a majority of them are actually better than their regular counterparts. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the newly hatched Zoea. It corrupts all yellow items, a tier of items that is generally extremely good, and probably are one of the best tier items in the game, and instead turns into a single item that for every 60 seconds, gain a random Void ally, which sounds great. Unfortunately, these Void allies consist of Void Reavers, Void Jailers, and Void Devastators, and that means when your allies die, they will create a black Void of Death, which will then kill you and anything that's inside of it. Meaning that the more of these yellow items that you have, if they're corrupted by the Zoea, they will then fuel your imminent demise with more and more Void bubbles. So, in no means should anyone ever consider taking a Zoea over having a Shatter Spleen, or a Charge Perforator, or a Little Disciple, or even a Beetle Guard. Moving on from the Doormat tier, in C tier, I've put items that I think have a purpose, but a very niche purpose at best. So, things that when you see, you might consider scrapping them, but ultimately they may have a purpose depending on your survivor or run. The first item I'm going to go over is going to be the Personal Shield Generator. Now, initially, I would have put this item in F tier had this list been created a few months ago. However, with the release of the Survivors of the Void DLC, the Plasma Shrimp has given new life to the once thought garbage Personal Shield Generator. While the Personal Shield Generator is the biggest culprit of ruining one-shot protection, it now, due to the Plasma Shrimp, has an actual purpose in that it can extend the shield needed to use the Plasma Shrimp. So, if it weren't for the Plasma Shrimp, Personal Shield Generator would be F tier, probably worse than the Bison Steak. But because the Personal Shield Generator now has a good use outside of that, I think that it deserves to be in C tier. Another item in C tier that I think might definitely get me into hot water with my local government is definitely going to be the Power Elixir. Well, the Power Elixir itself is actually a pretty good item, and I do try to carry one during my runs if I can. I honestly think that the answer for people who use the Power Elixir and who think that the Power Elixir is good is definitely just get better at the game, bro. Last and certainly least in C tier, I have the Singularity Band. Nothing, besides perhaps seeing Tom Brady fraudulently win more Super Bowls, disappoints me more than seeing this heap of garbage pop out of a Void Cradle. As a loader main, my favorite two items and my main source of damage is Kajaros and Reynolds bands. So, to have this item, which corrupts both bands and turns them into a fraction of their damage, is very disheartening and is basically like signing a death warrant. With that being said, the Singularity Band is not completely awful and in fact does have some slight, albeit mostly irrelevant, advantages over regular bands. The Singularity created does have a proc coefficient, which means that enemies that are inside of it will be affected by other items like ATGs, ukuleles, etc., etc. However, none of that comes close to the damage and raw power of a Kajaros and Reynolds band. Moving on into B tier, we have items that are actually good. These items are actually useful and will generally make a noticeable improvement to some runs. However, These items aren't fantastic, and some of them can be somewhat survivor dependent. But in general, they're actually fairly solid, and I would take most of these items in any run. Kicking things off in B tier, and the item on this list that is probably the most likely to get me sent to the guillotine is the Delicate Watch. Now, honestly, you could probably make a good case for the Delicate Watch to be in A tier, if not even possibly S tier, because truly this is potentially one of the best items in the game. However, I have a very strong and deep personal bias against the Delicate Watch, which prevents it from reaching its true potential. I am not a fan of the game mechanic where something works or doesn't work based on a low health percentage, i.e. Power Elixir, Dio's best friend. Is that very personal, and is that really relevant to the game? No, but it's my list. So the Delicate Watch is in B tier.
I liked them first. Before I even met them, I liked them.
Yes,
I saw them, I liked them right away. You hate them compared to how much I like them.
Shut up, you're so annoying!
Also in B tier, I have put the Monster Tooth. I don't get why the Monster Tooth is so hated. Personally, I think it's a fantastic... I can't speak. The Monster Tooth is a fantastic item because it gives 2% health, percent, not flat, just a flat number. It's 2% health per stack of Monster Tooth from a tiny little orb that drops for every enemy killed. Every enemy. So like if you're doing a teleporter event and you're inside a small sphere, a lot of the monster orbs are going to be able to be picked up without even actively looking for them. You could just passively pick up 2% health for every enemy you kill, not to mention more if you have more stacks of Monster Tooth. So I think it's really good for teleporter events. Maybe not as useful outside of a teleporter event, or like void fields, for example, but I think especially in those cases, Monster Tooth really shines, and I think it deserves a solid B tier for its effective passive healing. Moving on in B tier, I also have the Delightful Mask. I think this item requires a bit of know-how from the player in order to truly extract its full potential, otherwise it could honestly be a C tier item. It synergizes very well with the 57-leaf clover because the Joyful Mask normally has a 7% chance to spawn an ally. Not great. However, with the 57-leaf clover, if you happen to have one, the Gleeful Mask's chance to spawn an enemy goes up greatly, meaning that the number of enemies shooting at you and your overall aggro is going to be a lot lower. On top of there will be more allies, so more damage, but let's be real, you're not coming to the Content Mask for extra damage. It also does very well against Mithric's Phase 4. The Merry Mask, if you're able to spawn just a single Lunar Chimera, whether it be a ground or a Wisp Lunar Chimera, will be incredibly effective at dealing against Phase 4. This brings us into A tier. A and S tier are going to be tiers of items that really are honestly good on pretty much any survivor. So I'm not going to have much to say because I think most people can agree that the items in these tiers deserve to be here. With that being said, I think an item that does deserve an explanation is probably Roll of Pennies. Pennies is... it's probably low A tier. It's definitely not on the same quality as, say, a Goat of, or Bleed, or Medkit, or most of the other items. However, I personally find a lot of use in pennies due to specific enemies. You can exploit the use of pennies with specific enemies like imps or burning elites, because for every single tick of damage, you gain money. So, for instance, on burning elites, if you just stand in their fire, yeah, you'll be set on fire and take a lot of damage, but you'll get a lot of money, which I think if you're able to exploit that use, I think it bumps it up into A tier.
What inspired you to take this item?
Money!
Also in A tier, I'm sure you'll notice I have Head Stompers at the top of Reds. Why? Because I can clear the entire map. Enough said, moving on. Finally in A tier, I'd like to talk about the Potato Mine. This is hands down one of my favorite items in the game. If I could have any boss item in a run, honestly, I might take Potato Mine over some of the items in S tier. Although, admittedly, it is objectively, and even in my own opinion, less powerful than a Shatter Spleen or a Charge Perf. It's still very useful in the fact that you can basically just run around an enemy, sprint, and deal 300% damage incredibly quickly and consistently, and kill enemies without even having to attack them. But what brings this item all the way up into A tier, and arguably could be an S tier item, is the fact that the orb shot out by the Potato Mine is an orb that has a proc coefficient, which means that as your run goes on, You could literally just run around an enemy, and then once the Potato Mine's orb hits an enemy, it'll shoot out ATGs, your ukuleles, bands, etc. You know, it can crit, it can, you know, proc stun grenades, sticky bombs, all the sort. All you have to do in the late game is just run around. That's all you have to do to deal damage. Just run around. That's it. It's a lot of fun. And if I could put it in S tier, I would, but it just doesn't match Spleen or Perforator. Alright, finally. After about 7.5 minutes, well, this brings us to S tier. So, to start things off. Gasoline. Honestly, if I see a multi-shop with a Gasoline, Shades, and a Tougher Times in a multi-shop on stage 1, I'm taking the Gasoline every single time. Because having a Gasoline, I'll put it this way, having a Gasoline as opposed to having a singular pair of Crit Shades or a singular Tougher Times is going to make a much bigger difference. No white item has as much impact as a single Gasoline does. Perhaps maybe like a backup mag on certain survivors. But honestly, the Gasoline is used for Deathmark. It's fantastic for AoE. It does a lot of damage. It helps with wisps, with the smaller enemies. It's really useful early on. Not to mention it stacks with infusion tanks, and I mean, there's just so much going for it, honestly. I put Gasoline so high in S tier because of its utility. It's very useful. It doesn't have maybe as much potential as Tougher Times or Shades, but it still is one of the best items in the game, period. Jumping 10 meters to the last item on this tier list I will discuss, we have the Wax Quail. Ladies and gentlemen, I know the Wax Quail may not be the biggest, the strongest, or the most powerful item on the playground. But I'm putting the Quail in S tier because I care about the little guy. The guy that gets picked last in Kickball. The guy who doesn't have precious movement abilities. The guy that runs the most miles but only sees a war banner for reward. The guy that gets no items on stage because the devs won't balance the game. The guy that donates $80 to a female Twitch streamer and doesn't even get his name written on a board. The guy whose mantra is hustle, loyalty, and respect. The nice guy that always gets shafted and finishes last. The guy among us that truly deserves respect. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm putting Quail in S tier because I support our troops who day in and day out march on to battle while suffering from the incurable disease, shiftlessness syndrome. Thank you. Also, I'm sure you'll notice, I did not talk about a single lunar item on this list. It's because I don't use them.